Last school year, millions of students joined their classes by logging onto Zoom. In-person group projects were replaced with online breakout rooms. Paper tests were swapped out for digital submissions. The sudden shift to remote learning definitely had its ups and downs, but students, parents, and educators made it through. Now, as summer comes to a close and kids and teenagers head back to physical classrooms, how has learning changed?
I think that one thing I learned or would like to take with me, just as far as a philosophy standpoint, is the reminder that students need flexibility just like adults need flexibility. And sometimes we get so into our process as educators of this has to be an exact deadline. And if they didn't do it by this moment, then they obviously didn't care. And it's easy to get kind of sucked into that when that's not always the case. So explicitly teaching students when and how to ask for what they need to be successful, and reminding myself that it's okay to give that flexibility.
That's Colleen Peluso, an English teacher at Valparaiso High School in Valparaiso, Indiana. Last August, Peluso's district allowed students to choose between in-person or online learning. This meant Peluso and many other teachers were simultaneously teaching face-to-face and over Zoom.
It was very flexible for students, which was good. It was very difficult on teachers. And one of the things that happened early on in the process in September was the teachers realized that we were essentially doing double work of planning, because we were planning lessons that would be useful for in-person and remote students and doing all that double preparation. And so we went to our school board to ask for what we called e-learning Wednesdays, which would mean everybody learned asynchronously at home on Wednesdays. So the teachers had a day to touch base with their remote students and their remote families. The teachers had a day to prepare all of this stuff and grade and basically keep our heads above water for the work that we were having to do.
Peluso admits that it was hard at times to keep her entire class engaged in the curriculum. How do you create a connection with a struggling student that you've never seen in person?
I had a handful of students who were remote learners that were A students, did their work, were on top of everything. I had several students who probably had about the same performance level as they would have in the classroom. They did the work they needed to get by, but they weren't worried about putting in too much extra engagement or energy. And then I had students that I rarely heard from. Sometimes they didn't log on to Zoom, and that became a lot of parent involvement or trying to get parents involved, working with our guidance and our social workers here at the school, working with administration, because in class, I can send a kid to the counselor. I can have them come up to me after class and say, hey, tell me what's going on. What's keeping you from being engaged today? Or I've noticed you've missed several assignments. Talk to me about what's happening. How can I be helpful? Whereas remotely, you can't do that.
However, in some circumstances, online learning allowed her to better understand why some students were distracted. She saw some teenagers step into the role of caregiver for younger siblings while parents were at work. She had one student who joined Zoom while driving a parent to a doctor's appointment. Peluso says seeing these extenuating circumstances firsthand made her a more understanding and compassionate teacher.
There was all sorts of circumstances this year that we kind of developed the mantra of grace and flexibility, giving students a little bit more slack than we normally would and being flexible with our expectations. And I had to learn to do that for myself too, to give myself some grace and flexibility. I'm normally very hard on myself as an educator, and there were some things I just had to let go of because I wouldn't have, I don't want to be dramatic, but I don't think that I would have been able to get through the year with any semblance of success without giving myself some grace in areas that I wouldn't necessarily have done so before.
The pandemic has forced many Americans to do the same. Sometimes giving yourself a break or a little more understanding can help in the long run. Peluso and other educators are keeping this mentality front and center as they welcome students back into classrooms this fall. With all of the disruptions over the last 18 months, there's no doubt that there will be an adjustment period. Ronald Chiluisan, a former teacher and the executive director of the Newark Trust for Education, says it's important for adults to gauge how young people are feeling about the return to school.
Listen to what they have to say. I think we have a great chance of quickly addressing some of the issues that came up because kids were isolated for such a long time. But I think that notion of asking young people where they are in this process, they are super smart on these questions. When you ask kids whether they're 6, 7, or 8, or 13, or 16, they know the answers. They know how they're interacting with the world at this particular moment in time.
Each student is different, and some may be more ready to go back than others. Chilui-san says that with the pandemic, it's important to explain why what they're learning matters.
Every single piece that we teach kids, there is a purpose for why that is taught. And it's important to really help kids understand the purpose for what is being taught. My experience is that as you do that, kids are much more likely to be engaged in learning it if they know why they're learning it and why it's important. I think this year in particular coming up, that notion of why are we spending time on this right now is going to be a critical question, because they're coming back from this really big disruption. They are coming back from a time where they questioned everything around what's important. Family relations are important, right? The ability to connect with friends is important.
The pandemic, in many ways, has revealed what's truly important. It's also made people more resourceful. Students can now tune into a lesson from their kitchen table or graph out a math problem using a tablet.
I think that an important next step is really to understand the advancements that they made on using technology, their comfort level, their literacy level on digital devices, and how they move forward in their understanding of digital devices in their learning process. I do hope that we do not lose the connection to digital learning and remote learning in this transition back to school buildings.
Peluso agrees. Over the past year, she saw how some students absorbed material better in an online setting. Remote learning, like several other learning approaches, is just another tool in the toolbox.
There's a lot that I learned. And one thing with just the technology is that we have access to Zoom now and video conferencing. And so if a student is home because they had a doctor's appointment, or they're home sick where they shouldn't be at school, but they are able to function and they would rather not get behind, that they can lay in bed with the sniffles or a low-grade fever, and if they're up for it, I can Zoom them into the class and they don't miss anything. Because as you probably remember, missing a day of high school, sometimes you come back and you spend a week playing catch up on whatever it was that you missed.
Along with having an extra option, Peluso believes that both students and teachers walked away from this past year with some new practical skills.
I think that a lot of them learned things they probably didn't even realize they learned. And it's those, we call them soft skills, right? So communication and collaboration and all of the things that aren't necessarily content on the exams. But if you're not successful in those skills, you're not going to be successful in the outside world. I always tell my students, I don't care if they remember the plot of the book. I might quiz them on it as we go to make sure they're reading, but ultimately that's not the point. The point is, can they think critically? Can they collaborate? Can they communicate their ideas, whether in writing or verbally? And so much of that is just practicing doing it. I had students who told me they never wrote an email to a teacher until this year or this past year, because they would just rather come up and talk to them because they could explain it better verbally than in writing. Well, explaining yourself in writing, though, is an important skill.
Peluso says the remote learning experience taught her how to be a more understanding and tech-savvy teacher, amongst other things. But she's ready to get back to a full classroom of students.
As I started doing a little bit of planning for the first few weeks of school, I just kept thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be so much easier. This is going to be so much easier. I don't have to worry about all the contingency plans. And that could change at any moment, but that is my hope, is that I can put more of my energy and focus into being a better educator and a more engaging educator, as opposed to a surviving educator. So that is my goal.
To learn more about this topic and our guests, Colleen Peluso and Ron Chilui-san, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written by Bridget Killian and Amira Zaveri. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price.
New studies show for the first time that reducing air pollution may roll back the risk of dementia. Research reported at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference 2021 shows a clear connection between air quality and physical brain changes defining Alzheimer's disease. What's more, reducing fine particulate matter in the air is associated with slower cognitive decline and a 20% reduction in dementia risk. Claire Sexton is Director of Scientific Programs and Outreach at the Alzheimer's Association.
What's exciting is we're now seeing data showing that improving air quality may actually reduce the risk of dementia. Air pollution is bad for our brains and our overall health. This demonstrates the importance of policies and action by both governments and businesses that address air pollution.
Studies were conducted in large populations in the U.S. and France. Sexton says the findings are especially important in urban areas where higher levels of air pollution are common. Find out more at alz.org.
Cardiovascular or CV disease is the #1 killer of adults in the U.S., and millions of people trying to reduce their risk of a heart attack or stroke may unknowingly be taking medications that are not proven nor FDA approved to reduce cardiovascular risk. Let's hear from cardiologist Dr. John Osborne.
Many people are unaware that after a failed outcome study, the FDA revoked the approval of fenofibrates when added to statins, as the risk outweighed the benefits to heart health. It's important to remember that statins, along with diet and exercise, can lower cardiovascular risk by about 25 to 35%, but persistent cardiovascular risk, which can lead to a life-threatening event, may remain. I would tell anyone still being prescribed fenofibrates, such as Tricor and Trilipix, with a statin, to talk to their doctor about FDA-approved therapies for cardiovascular risk reduction.
To learn more and get clear on the facts, visit itscleartomenow.com. Again, that's itscleartomenow.com.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.
Coming up on Viewpoints.
From how you sleep, where you sleep, the background noise, the physiology of how the circadian system normally works on Earth, all of these are impacted.
The conundrum of getting good sleep in space. Then,
people were able to educate themselves. They were able to get the expertise they needed to make the case that it was in the long-term interests of El Salvador to kick out the mining companies and save their rivers.
The Environmental Heroes of El Salvador. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.